An enormous failure is how the federal government has described efforts to address Indigenous disadvantage through closing the gap measures. Recently, rates of Indigenous incarceration, suicide rates and child removals are actually worsening. Today, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has announced almost $500 million of new funding for housing, water, food and education to be rolled out in partnership with Indigenous organisations in a bid to improve outcomes. Another part of that effort is the planned referendum later this year on an Indigenous advisory body to Parliament. Referendum correspondent Dan Borscher joins us now from Canberra. And Dan, where is this money going to be spent and what on?
Yeah, Gemma, good afternoon. Well, we've heard that the system as it has been in place is simply not working, and the Minister saying that there have been those enormous challenges really because there just hasn't been the development or the improvements in some of those closing the gap targets, particularly as you mentioned around incarceration and suicide rates, which are getting worse and worse year on year. So we know that this money today, $450 million of new money, will be used in partnership with those across government, but also with Indigenous organisations as well, and those working on the front line. $150 million or so of that will be used within remote communities to improve water supply and to ensure that that water is safe. There'll be more than $60 million going to support women and children who are suffering as a result of family and domestic violence and interactions with the legal system. There'll be also $100 million for housing in the Northern Territory. And this morning we heard Pat Dodson, the Labor Senator, say that this is just part of what's required to help ease some of those pressures in overcrowding in homes, particularly in some remote and regional parts of the Northern Territory. And if that can be addressed, that then there's a good chance of dealing with some of those chronic diseases, including rheumatic heart disease. But a big part of this is really building on the reset that we saw in recent years, an expansion of those targets for closing the gap, and the Prime Minister sought to outline his view of that in the Parliament today.
The report lays out forensically one lopsided statistic after another in health, education, incarceration rates, and especially damning life expectancy. These aren't gaps, they're chasms. It is clear that not enough support has been directed towards organisations to deliver for communities. It is clear that we have leapt too swiftly from a climate of forceful intervention to simply telling communities, you're on your own.
For decades, Coalition and Labor governments alike have been on a unity ticket to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. Whilst we welcome what improvements have been made, the conditions today in Alice Springs, as pointed out by the Prime Minister, demonstrate that the situation is, in reality and certainly by many indicators, worse for Indigenous kids and their parents than it was 15 years ago.
Dan, today is also the anniversary of the apology to the stolen generations.
Yeah, it is, Gemma, and hundreds of members of the Stolen Generations gathered here in Parliament House today to remember and reflect on that occasion, and in many sad instances to consider those who have lost their lives in that time. I was speaking to an auntie and elder from Victoria, and she said it was bittersweet. It was good to be here to mark this and to reflect and remember, but that it also came with the difficulty and challenging times of those people that have been lost. And certainly there was a lot of conversation today about what's come out of that apology 15 years ago and the tangible outcomes still to come. Linda Burney is the Minister for Indigenous Australians. She spoke at that event this morning.
There are very few families, if any, in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia that have not been affected, and you are the living embodiment of that. The apology was so important for this country, delivered by the then Prime Minister, Dr. Kevin Rudd, in the Parliament, to people who had come from across the country. I remember the day so well. To finally hear the word, the first step to healing, sorry. The apology shone a light on those truths our country had looked away from for decades. The dispossession, the murder, the removal and the discrimination that went unchecked for so long. The consequences of which we live with today.
And Linda Burney yesterday spoke to members of the Stolen Generation and said in what can only be considered a veiled swipe at the opposition leader that those that turned their back on that apology 15 years ago and say they regret it should not make that same mistake now in conversations being had about The Voice. And in fact, in just the last couple of hours, Linda Burney has told the ABC that she thought it was a mistake that Peter Dutton didn't attend that breakfast and meet with those members of the Stolen Generation earlier today. He did, though, speak to them directly in Parliament this afternoon.
Say, in an unscripted way, I apologise for my actions, and the Prime Minister's frequently able to point it out that I didn't attend the chamber for the apology 15 years ago. I've apologised for that in the past, and I repeat that apology again today.
The opposition leader also saying that he missed the symbolism and the importance of that moment, Gemma, and that his reasoning for that was really as a result of his career in policing some 9 years earlier.
And Dan, as you said, these events come as the country prepares for the referendum on The Voice.
Yeah, they certainly do. And Linda Burney, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, made a direct link with from the apology through the Closing the Gap initiatives, the measures and the refresh, and today's funding announcement through to the Voice to Parliament as well, and said that it had been an evolution around these mechanisms of recognising and becoming a more reconciled nation. The Minister also took the opportunity to call for bipartisanship and for all Australians to support the referendum, which all voters will be voting in likely in the final few months of this year.
This year, there will be a referendum on constitutional recognition through The Voice. And it is my deepest hope, my deepest wish, that Australians vote yes. Yes to an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. And yes to a better future of a united Australia.
The opposition leader is still saying, along with the opposition Gemma, that there are still many questions to be answered about The Voice, about what it would do and how it would work. They'll likely get a chance to air some of those questions with many of the Indigenous people at the major discussion table when they meet with the referendum working group, which we're expecting to happen later this week.
Dan Borsha, our referendum correspondent. Thank you.